Afternoon, everyone. My name is Tim Wortham Jr., and myself, along with my colleague Rebecca Sharuk, bring you greetings from the Office of Alumni Engagement. We are so happy to have you join us for this Just Mercy discussion today. Obviously, we are all very proud of our fellow alumnus, Dr. Bryan Stevenson, and this wonderful work that we have all been using for many years, and that the nation and the world have now become familiar with due to the recent film being released. And we look forward to a very lively and engaging discussion this afternoon. Here I go again. And I am honored and very privileged to introduce our facilitator for today, Dr. Kimberlee Johnson, who's Assistant Professor of Urban Studies Program, Director of the Center for Community Engagement and Prison Education Program, and someone who I am not just blessed enough to be a colleague of, but I have grown to be such a fan of in my short time at Eastern University. I'm very honored that she would join us in this capacity today. And so at this time, I'm going to turn you into her very capable hands and enjoy right along with you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Tim, for that introduction. I am really excited about being the facilitator of this discussion. This afternoon, the topics and the themes that are raised in the film Just Mercy and in the book on which the movie is based are topics that are near and dear to my heart and are very much associated to the work of my hands. And so I'm hoping that during this time we can just have some time for you to share your feedback and maybe process some of your emotional and intellectual responses to the themes that are raised in the movie. So one of the things I did was last night I watched the movie over again because the first time I saw Just Mercy was when it came out. And I did remember that there were some things that were in the book, a lot of things that were in the book that were not necessarily in the film. So this conversation is going to center around the things that were brought up in the film. So just by way of getting us started, I'm going to ask if we would do a couple of things. So the first is, I'm sure we're all familiar with Zoom, but just in case we're not, just know that you have the ability to mute and unmute yourself. And we're going to ask that while we are in discussion, that unless we're speaking, we'll just keep ourselves muted. But you feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to respond to a question. Also, if you click at the bottom of your screen, it might be at the bottom, on the navigation bar, you will see an area there that says participants. You can see everyone that's listed there. You can see that there's a chat area. We will use the chat area in order to type our responses. If there's something we want to write, I'll try to pay attention to what's happening over there as well. I don't want to call out names, but I just see some familiar alumni faces. I've been at Eastern. Wave to me if we know each other. Yes. I've been at Eastern for over 23 years now. And so I'm just seeing some people here from a long time ago. So good to see you again. I see members of SOAR, which was Students Organized Against Racism, which was one of the ministries that was on our campus some time ago. So it's good to see a number of SOAR alumni who are here as well. Okay, so just by way of getting started, I'm going to ask if everyone in the chat area, if you would just type a one or two word response to the film. When you walked out of the theater or when the credits rolled as you watched it at home, what are just a couple of thoughts that were going through your mind, or how were you feeling, just in one or two words after the movie was over? And I'll participate as well. Okay, I see thought-provoking, sad, hopeful, frustrated, inspired, eye-opening, hope, depressed and committed, heavy yet uplifted heart, shocking truths, challenged, hopeless and hopeful, astounded and determined, share our stories, wow, sad and hopeful at the same time. Anyone else? Powerful and moving. Good. Anyone else like to share? Overwhelming, certainly overwhelming. Any other contributions in 1 or 2 words? Okay, those tend to be the ones, right? Whether we are familiar with these issues or not, the movie does certainly evoke a lot of those responses. I want to share just a little bit of a narrative, and then I'll ask a discussion question, and anyone can participate by responding to this. And then what we'll do toward the end is if you have additional questions, or even as we're in conversation with each other, you can feel free to raise those as well. So let's start with something kind of easy. Can we talk about Bryan Stevenson, our esteemed alum? When Bryan Stevenson was at Eastern, he studied, I believe, philosophy and something else. I think he was primarily a philosophy major. When he graduated, he attended Harvard Law School, which they mentioned in the film. He was a great student there. But despite the fact that he received a lot of great offers after coming out of Harvard Law School, he decided that he would move to Montgomery, Alabama, and start a law firm to provide legal defense to people who were on death row and awaiting execution. His faith inspired him. His experience at Eastern, we know, formed him. And he decided not to choose a probably more financially lucrative lifestyle, but he decided to go and serve the least of these in Montgomery, Alabama. And so my first question is this: how does Stevenson's countercultural understanding of vocation, meaning God's call on each of our lives, challenge us to reconsider how we define success? How does his countercultural understanding of vocation challenge us to reconsider how we define success? And by the way, I'm getting the framing of some of these questions from an esteemed colleague at another university who wrote Rethinking Incarceration, Professor Gilliard. So thoughts? Everyone here is an Eastern grad. Can we talk a bit about vocation? How does his choice challenge us to reconsider how we define success? Is Bryan Stevenson a success? And to speak, please unmute yourself. Yes.
He looked at it through Jesus's eyes, like when Jesus said, "Go throughout the world and spread the gospel." That's the way he was looking at it, not the way the world sees success, where success is, getting money and being successful. So he didn't see it that way, which is kind of strange. Like you could go, he had a chance to go to like the top law firms, but he went all the way down in Alabama, and I don't even know if I would even do that, because that was rough. That was really rough.
Yes. Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Thanks for that feedback. Anyone else? How does Bryan Stevenson's work challenge our idea of success?
I'll gladly jump in. Culturally, we have so many messages that preach to us daily that success is defined by what we can accumulate. And Bryan shows us that true success is about what we're able to contribute. And so it really turns culture on its head in the sense that I'm not out here on a mission to serve myself, but truly I have been formed, fashioned, and called to find a mission that serves others. And I think that that's how I was challenged by the film.
Awesome. Thank you for that feedback. Tim's also an Eastern alum. Anyone else?
I'll jump in on this. Hello, everyone. I'm Felicia Brown. Excuse the sunglasses. I have a broken eye vessel. So I need this for protection. But
you're looking snazzy.
Thank you. That's the theater side as well. So honestly, it's interesting because I look at this and for me, being that I chose education as the field in which I am now practicing, it kind of goes along with this because let's be for real, educators are not always highly praised. We're considered successful in the world, and yet we keep deciding to give. And so honestly, when I see someone like Bryan Stevenson, it's encouraging. As a person who's out there going, all right, let me keep pouring into these kids. Let me keep pouring into these kids. Even when you're sitting there going, oh, great, now I'm doing it all virtually. How do I keep pouring in? How do I keep connecting? How do I keep helping them to grow and to see their dreams and to seek, fulfillment in their life in a way that's not necessarily what the world might consider successful, but does something moving and powerful in their hearts and in their lives. And right now is a great time for that because they're seeing what's happening in the world and they're being challenged to see a difference. So that's all I have.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And a good cultural observation. Some of you wrote in the chat box that you were maybe astounded or shocked that there were some things that were overwhelming, eye-opening for you. What were some of the things in the film for you that were either shocking, surprising, or appalling? Name some of those things that you saw.
When the character he had to go under the electric chair, like that was horrible. I mean, just because this man was suffered from PTSD and didn't get the help that he needed, but it didn't matter to the court system. It didn't matter, that Bryan had had given up those things, but it didn't matter. So it was really upsetting because I tried to see it the second time, but when I got to that part, I couldn't get through the movie after that.
Yeah, that was a difficult scene to watch, wasn't it? And I, for one, was grateful that they didn't show the actual electrocution. So you raised two issues. I heard you raise two issues, Shonda. One thing that was concerning for you was the fact that someone with PTSD, so someone who had a mental health issue, was on death row. So that raised something for you. And I also heard you say just the electrocution itself also was an issue for you as well. Thank you for sharing. Someone else, what was shocking, surprising, or appalling about the film?
This is Tim April. The movie and also these events that we're hearing about, and these are just the ones that we're hearing about, by the way, in the news, I understand. Mm-hmm. The question I keep asking myself is, how is this still happening? And that's the biggest question that I just can't understand. I can't wrap my head around when we think about the progress that we have made. How, and I apologize, I'm driving, so I'm trying to be safe here.
Okay.
How are we, with the advances that we've made, the progress that we made, how are we still, how are people still treating other human beings the way that they're being treated, like animals? And I cannot understand. And maybe I don't want to understand, but that's the biggest question for me. How is this still happening? And how can we realistically put real actionable steps to stop it long term? Like, what is it? What are the little things that we can be doing every day in our interactions with each other? What is it? I mean, there's no easy answer. I understand, but like that's what keeps coming up for me is how, and my heart breaks. How is this stuff still happening? That was my response.
That's great. And we're going to go down that road, but can we flesh this out a little bit, Tim? Let's define what the this is that we're talking about. When I hear you say, how is this still happening? What are some of the things that you see that are still consistently happening that I'm inferring from what you're stating that are unjust? Just
the way we're treating people. Like when we talk about, the police brutality, or if it's systemic, if it's this whole thing where Black people are discouraged from owning property, or whatever it is. If it's systemic, if it's a police officer that's mistreating someone, like no matter what it is, whether it's on a wider system level or an individual incident, how is it that people can do these kinds of things and think it's okay?
Mm-hmm. Yes, good. Some more philosophical and theological question as well.
Right.
How do people think it's okay? But I just want us to stick for a minute with naming what the issues are, because I think it's important for us to do that. So let's just go back to some of the things in the film. So Tim mentioned police brutality. Okay, that was one issue that we saw. But what else?
I wanted to touch base with what, and kind of, it makes sense with what Tim was saying.
Mm-hmm.
I was working in a mental hospital in Tuscaloosa in 1967, and the governor decided that the blacks could no longer worship with the whites. And as a chaplain, it was my job to go to them and give them this information. And I just felt a crushing, not only certainly among the blacks who that had normally actually been doing it up to that point, but as a white person, I felt crushed. And Tim was saying, this is still going on today. It almost feels like, where have we gone?
Mm-hmm.
That's what
and
the
I
whole
think
issue is with it.
That's the importance for us to realize that we are really called by our Lord to constantly keep up this message that Jesus Christ makes the difference in this, that somehow we need to break through the political, break through the societal demands of success is actually power in most people's lives. And that's what we were experiencing. We felt overpowered in what we were doing there.
Mm. Thank you. Thank you so much. You raise a lot of additional issues as well. When you talk about misuse of power, I'm just jotting a few things in the chat area that were also coming to my mind as both of you were talking in terms of what are these things that are still happening that point to this systemic issue, right? So police brutality, we saw that. What about pretrial detention on death row? Did anyone catch that in the film? So we had Mr. McMillan was put on death row before he ever even had a trial, right? That's unheard of. Another issue that's related to that we see still happening today has to do with pretrial detention in general. So we have people who are arrested, who are put into jail, and perhaps they're given bail. But because they are poor and they cannot afford bail, they stay in jail until their trial comes up. And despite the fact that we say that people have a right to a speedy trial, by time people get continuances of their hearing, someone could be incarcerated for a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, waiting for their case to come up. Not because they're not inside because they're guilty, They're not inside because they've been convicted. They're inside because they're too poor to post the bail. Okay, we saw that with Sandra Bland, if you're familiar with the Sandra Bland case. We saw that with the Khalif Browder case as well, a young boy who was on Rikers for 3 years, accused of stealing a backpack, which he didn't do, and was horribly abused during that time because his mother couldn't afford, I think it was maybe $350 or something like that, of bail. So we also related to this issue of pretrial detention is this whole issue of really discrimination against the poor. One of Bryan Stevenson's most famous sayings is that the system treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent, right? He says that even in the film. Judicial override is another injustice that's mentioned in the movie. We don't have that in Pennsylvania, but there are states where judicial override is a thing. And basically what that means is that even when the jury decides that, I think the case in the movie, it wasn't McMillan's case, it was another character. Or no, it was McMillan. I think the jury decided that he would get life in prison. And the judge came back and overrode their decision and decided he would get the death penalty, right? That's judicial override. Framing and discrimination against Black people. We definitely saw that in the film. Mr. McMillan was framed by the prosecution, and many others participated in that. And also misuse of power. And I think we saw that on many different levels. What might be, and this may be an obvious question, you may think of some other things that should be here, but in what ways are we seeing these kinds of issues still playing out in the justice system today? What might be some examples? And you can think of something that's on the news, or you might have a personal story.
I just remember the whole thing, the case with Meek Mills. I mean, they kept doing just because of they said for probation kind of stuff. Like it was just really, silly things, and even when everybody's like, well, that's not fair. The judge was like, well, this is what I decided, and you don't say anything about it. But because he had high friends in high places, he was able to get free. But so many people that are in jail still for just like probational things, for minor offenses.
Right, minor violations. So a probation violation could certainly land you back in prison for a very long time. And sometimes we think of recidivism as reoffending, like committing another crime. But recidivism rates also include things like a probation violation might be not informing your probation officer that you are going from Pennsylvania to New Jersey to visit your family. Okay, for the rest of us, that's not a crime. That's not against the law. But if you are on, I'm sorry, the word I'm really meaning is parole, but if you have any of those stipulations and you violate them, you can end up back in prison. Yeah, and Meek Mills is a good example because he had those parole violations. Any other examples of these injustices that we still see today?
Like with the time when like the Black guy was like arrested like killed in Texas from that like at that convenience store, like he was trying to break up a disagreement, but like the police officers thought that he was the source of it, I think.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that case, but I'm hearing what you're saying. And I guess the subtext that I'm hearing there is that there are presumptions of guilt that are associated with Black and brown people. And those presumptions, those biases that law enforcement officers or other people in the system may have impact how they are treated. One of the things that we know from research is that if you are an African-American person, that you are more likely, if you are convicted of the same crime as your white counterpart, you're likely to get a longer sentence than your white counterpart. And so we see injustices all along the way in the system, from policing through sentencing. Another thing that impacts justice, which shouldn't, is income. If you're poor and you're unable to afford a private attorney, you don't get the same type of representation. And this is why Bryan Stevenson's work is just so significant and so meaningful, because he really did have the ability to make a lot of money doing what he's doing. He's a brilliant attorney, but he chose to represent not just people who were on death row, but indigent populations of people and children who also could not otherwise afford a robust legal defense. Okay. Any other examples?
I think of universal, immunity that police officers have with regards to committing a crime. I think I just recently learned that, they can essentially kill someone. That's why it's so hard to convict a police officer when they commit a crime, because there's this presumption of innocence that's already kind of built into the system, and there's this automatic immunity that's given to them. And so I really thought that to me is just like a reckless and glaring abuse of power, that you would just basically say, this person can do whatever they want, and the likelihood of them ever getting charged or facing consequences is very, very slim. And if you look at most of the cases that have been brought against police officers, whether it was an assault or rape or murder, very few of them have actually ever get charged and serve time. And a lot of that has to do with this universal immunity clause that's built into their contracts. So that's very dangerous and a clear abuse of power.
Yes, indeed. Qualified immunity.
There it is, qualified immunity.
Yes.
I knew I was saying wrong.
But you're raising a good point. It impacts someone's ability to successfully sue a police officer. What people don't recognize is that the same laws that apply to citizens do not apply to police officers. And that's why it's a systemic issue. People hit the streets because logic tells us that if someone so very obviously commits a crime, they should be arrested, right? Because that's just what we do in America. You commit a crime, officer shows up, you get arrested, and there are charges, and there's a normal process that plays out. That process does not apply to police officers. It just doesn't. It's just, those are not the rules. And so part of reform has to do with changing what the rules are. Someone wrote in the chat box, Teresa Church, also the police policing themselves. That's another excellent point, that in those cases where there is an investigation or charges are brought, that kind of thing, you have police basically investigating other police officers. And so there's a loss of objectivity in those cases. So some of the reform efforts are around changing that practice as well, having independent bodies who actually investigate cases of excessive force by police officers against civilians. Okay, Jennifer Tanner wrote, I see a triad of money, race, and mental health. Any combination where two or more are lacking will increase the odds of incarceration and unfair treatment. Because it is very difficult to uncouple these, it is tough to convince doubters about the systemic issues with our judiciary system. Excellent point. Yeah, when we have the intersectionality of those different demographic factors, it certainly does compound the likelihood of the unlikelihood of us getting justice.
Yeah, so I happen to live in Wyoming, and I'm constantly educating people. And I'll be honest, up until 10 years ago, I wasn't aware of the systemic issues. So I educated myself, and now I'm working to educate others. But it's very hard to convince extended family. It's tough because they just don't believe it.
Right. Did you take them to see Just Mercy? I'm just curious. Have they seen it?
Absolutely. My husband and I went, and afterwards we talked, and he said, well, I'm aware of, he's aware of some of the issues, but the extent of them. Or extended family members will just say, well, I don't believe that's true. We have a biracial son, and I say, he's far more likely to be pulled over. And people don't believe it.
Yeah. Yeah. So part of the necessary process for social change is education and helping people to really broaden and then change their thinking about issues. And when we talk about systemic issues, racism or anything else, sometimes it's difficult for people to accept the reality of something because they see it through the lens of their own personal experience. So if I've never experienced being harassed by the police, or if I've haven't seen in my family some of the kinds of issues that I'm hearing about, I tend to be less likely to believe that it's a real thing, right? To believe that this is really an issue that broadly affects lots of people over a broad period of time. When we're talking about systemic issues or institutional issues, we're talking about practices that are just embedded in how people do that work. So meaning you could have a very well-meaning person, for example, who wants to be a police officer. They can be a Christian, a person of faith. They can love others. They can be generous. I mean, they can be the most fantastic person you know. But when they become a police officer, they're now a part of a system that has some issues. Okay, so you always hear this, but there are good cops. No one's negating the fact that there are good cops. But even good cops are subject to the same policies around policing that every other police officer is. Even good cops are subject to having biases like every other person in the world is subject to having, right? So it's helping people to see those differences between those individual cases and the broader issue that impacts people. I did a presentation a couple weeks ago at a conference about policing, about racialized policing. And I don't want to derail into that, but it's just always interesting to me when I hear people negate other people's experience because of their own personal experience. And I think that's something we have to be very careful about. Even in the body of Christ, we can be well-meaning, but if it's not something we are exposed to all the time, it's harder for us to believe it. I think that was why seeing George Floyd murdered was a wake-up call for a lot of people. Not everybody. But when George Floyd was killed in the streets, I think for African-American people, they thought, this is what's been happening for years. Now everybody's seeing it, right? Now everybody's seeing the gruesomeness of this, the brutality of this. But this has been the African-American experience since slavery ended, right? Since slavery ended. And again, just to talk a little bit, I don't want to dominate the conversation, but you all interrupt me with questions, right? Well, Jennifer, let me know if I'm going too far.
I'll jump in to add what you're saying.
Great.
And also to what Jennifer is saying. And what I wrote in the text was we need to share our stories, right? Because there are people like Jennifer and I and others that are like a bridge between these two communities. And we have to be willing to share the things that we've seen and what our friends have experienced, because I too have family who see things on TV, But that for them is TV. You know, it's not based in any reality. That's just the sensational stories. That's not the everyday stories. So when I go to my family and I share the everyday stories, little by little, they begin to understand that this is a real thing and not just something that the biased media is trying to brainwash them with, you know? So I think sharing our stories, sharing the stories of the people in our lives is really important, because it takes it out of TV land and into actually what's really happening right here in your own town.
I think when you say sharing stories, just to piggyback off of that, I think the church can play a big role in helping to create spaces where those stories can be shared. Unfortunately, what I'm finding in a lot of churches is that there is this hesitancy to even have these conversations around race. I know for my sister and I, we held a life group at one of the churches that we were attending. It was a multicultural, predominantly white church. And we did a group study around Woke Church, which is a book that another pastor here, Pastor Eric Mason, wrote around race and the response that Christians should have to the brutality that was happening in the streets. And, you know, we had an amazing life group. We had about 20 people that would meet regularly. And, you know, we were all coming from different backgrounds. And, you know, the white sisters and brothers got to hear from the Black brothers and sisters about, you know, what we were experiencing in real time. But when we tried to scale up, you know, our group and make it kind of like build it into the fabric of the church, there was a lot of pushback, and eventually we couldn't get it implemented. And that was, you know, that was very telling and very unfortunate. But I think that the church is playing a big role in helping to unfortunately uphold these systems of systemic racism. For whatever reason, I don't know, because it's not Christian to be doing these things. But yeah, we have a lot of work to do within our churches, just around giving space for people to share those stories, so that people can see the realities from other people's perspectives.
I'd like to share that there is an equal disparity among Native Americans. I had worked on Pine Ridge for a while, and also pastored a church in which Native Americans were not welcome in an American Baptist church. And there are murders going on constantly today, not just on Pine Ridge, but on reservations all around the United States. This systemic concept is unfortunately rooted. The Japanese faced similar problems during the war. It's not just one group, it's several groups. It's anybody that does not fit the culture and the expectations of that culture. I'll just throw that out.
Certainly. No, that's good. That's very true. There are a lot of marginalized groups in our country, and I'm glad you did bring up specifically the Native American population, because incarceration rates and discrimination by police against Native Americans is a major issue as well. So thank you for raising that. I want to piggyback off of what Lola raised about having conversations, and I think Caroline, you mentioned this too, having spaces to share our stories. And certainly Bryan Stevenson talks a lot about changing the narrative, and we can help to change people's thinkings by raising up compelling stories. But I appreciate what you're sharing, Lola, about the challenge with the church, that even though a space was created for people to come and share those stories and they were heard, when you actually wanted changes to happen, there was resistance. And I do think that is the challenge for the Christian community, to be able to move beyond just hearing stories to saying, okay, how do we now engage in a conversation around making changes so that all people are honored in whatever that community is and are treated with equity and with justice, whether it's in the judicial system or the policies at our church or whatever. That's the hard part, right, Lola? You know, I think the easier part, not that it's necessarily that easy, the easier part is coming together. We have the kumbaya moments and we can cry and share each other's pain because we're empathetic people. But it reminds me of the story in the Gospels about the tax collector. Was that Zacchaeus who was up in the tree? And we all know tax collectors, they would basically rip off the Jewish people, right? And they got rich off of extortion. But when he came to Christ, the story goes on to tell us that he didn't just decide to follow Jesus, but he gave people, I think it was 4 times their money back that he had stolen from them. And so I think it's those kinds of efforts where we begin to say, how do we start to make what's wrong right? So if we know that there's a issue with pretrial detention, how do we start to make that right? If we know there's an issue of putting people on death row before they are even tried, how do we make that right? Not just feel bad about it, but then what do we do about it? That's the harder work. Shasta, she had her hand up maybe 10 minutes ago, and she's been waiting very patiently. So I want to give you the floor. Who would you like to share?
Yes, I just wanted to say, you have just brought up so many points as well as all the other participants, but I want to say that I am definitely one of the people who had that great awakening when that happened to George Floyd. But my awakening kind of had like a preparatory situation where with Ahmaud Arbery, I was like, was a fraud detective? Like so many things just started coming together. So I mean, over even the last month, I have just been trying to ask myself, why wasn't I aware of this systemic racism? What exactly was preventing me from having this eye-opening experience? And then I just started thinking, well, you know, maybe I lived in a fairy tale land, you know, going to Eastern and then into the military. And then I was a military police officer for nearly a decade. And in the military, we have this thing where we all say, well, you know, we all bleed the same color in the military, green. In the Army, we bleed green. So I felt like I was just layered upon layer of protection. And then also just by being a Christian, it's always like, you know, God's got me, you know, I might be, you know, I don't really have to worry so much because whatever is going to happen is going to happen. If this happens, God's got me. If this, it's almost like I pretty much have to find a, you know, the line in the sand. Like, where do I draw that line in the sand of just having all this super, like, it's in my mind about, it's kind of difficult to find the words, but you are so eloquent in the way that you put these words. I even wrote a few notes down asking, well, why did it take all of this? Like, you know, every now and then I would hear, you know, like, that's not fair or this. But when I say I am experiencing right now at the age of 58, a severe paradigm shift. And what is really hitting me right now is when you say, once we realize it, what can we do? What is our role? How do we affect change? Now, I never ever thought that I would be in the midst of something where my eyes had to really be opened, because
out to the kitchen.
It's just pretty phenomenal. So that what you're talking about, it's real. Whether or not we acknowledge it and become a part of the system, it's just, for me, this is just a blessing. So thank you for having this and giving us the opportunity to exchange thoughts and just hear it. Like, this is the reality right now. And it's kind of sealing the deal with me that None of this is just like all in my mind. This is what my sisters and brothers are experiencing. And then to put the cherry on top of everything, I only learned in June that I'm the great niece of Zachariah Walker. And so I'm like, he was lynched by fire in only 1911. And I feel like we still haven't made that much progress. So.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank
you
you.
for sharing. Yeah, you shared a lot. And we thank the alumni planning team for thinking of and putting together this forum, Tim and us. And we have 9 minutes left. I feel like we could talk for another 9 hours about this topic. I've had so many things down in my notes about the 1 in 9 people who are wrongfully convicted and sentenced to death in this country. The record number of exonerations that we saw last year of people who were wrongfully convicted and having their sentences overturned. I mean, there are just so many things we could discuss, but let me shift the conversation a little bit in the time we have and just ask you, what do you see as a way forward for people of faith in terms of making change around these issues? I have some ideas, but I would love to hear your thoughts.
I guess my thing, what I've been thinking about is a lot of times we always have a definition about these are the people that go to the kingdom. These are the people that don't. But we have to always remember that we all are going, we're all God's people. Doesn't matter if you're black, if you're white, if you're a woman, if you're queer, all of that. And I think a lot of times we always have a definition about who the good people are and who the bad people are. And that's what I think. We have to change the mentality.
Okay. Thank you. Changing the mentality. What else?
I believe people need to get more civically engaged, be more involved with their government. You mentioned police reform earlier. And there's these union contracts that really need to be picked through to help provide more accountability to police. There's stipulations in there on like how long they can be invested for a crime, or what sort of accountability they have to like a city safety board or a civilian review board. And there's little to no accountability in that. A lot of people talk about trying to get them to change, their practices like chokehold and all this. But the reality is, if they had a lot more accountability in terms of their contract negotiations and how they're investigated. That's one of the biggest things I learned from being on a police reform committee here. But not just that, just being more civically engaged in general and getting to know law practitioners in your community or the judges that are up for election. I'm finding more and more even some of the Republican judges here are becoming more empathetic and more aware of critical race theory and injustices within the prison system, and are trying to find alternatives for rehabilitation. That's just my area of central Indiana. I don't know how that looks nationally, but I think the more people of faith, especially in churches, are willing to get involved with their government, the better off we're going to be. I think we're guilty of shying away a little bit and not taking proactive steps. So yeah, that's my thoughts about it.
That's great. Thank you for sharing, Thomas, Urban Studies grad. Others? I'm trying to capture some of the things that we're saying in the chat as well.
I would say, if I can jump in, that I do believe that the fight against racism has to start in the church. It has to start with the church. And I know we look to, our politicians and our lawmakers, but the truth of the matter is racism can't be legislated. It's not a law, it's a heart issue. And only God can change hearts. And so that has to come through active ministry. Like Dr. King preached against hate and injustice. It was part of his ministry, not just part of his civic duty. It was part of his ministry identity. And until we can, incorporate this fight against injustice, this fight against hatred into our sermons, into our Bible studies, into our Sunday schools, and not just pick and choose the things that we want to shine the spotlight on. This has to become part of the evil that exists in this world. It's got to become part of what we preach and what we demonstrate, and hopefully and prayerfully, one plants, another waters, and God gives the increase.
Amen. Thank you for that. A heart change is definitely needed. One of the resources that I would recommend is a book called The Color of Compromise by Jamar Tisby. I also wrote that in the chat area. And I don't know if Tim, maybe after this, if we could maybe capture the chat. It might be good to maybe send some summary or something like that to those who attended today. I would be happy to do that. But
Go ahead.
I recommend, just one second. I recommend The Color of Compromise because it speaks very specifically to the what has historically been the church's complicity in racism. And so I think a good, careful read of that book will help us to do the heart and hard work around these issues. And I will also just push a little bit and say, in addition to that, I appreciated what you said, Thomas, about civic engagement, that at the same time, we have to address issues of policy and practice as well. So even as we are being transformed by the renewing of our mind, even as that's happening, at the same time, I live in Philadelphia, I'll just use this as an example, we need to demilitarize our local police department. So we had right here in West Philadelphia not too long ago, people who were sitting on their porches who were subject to tear gas, right? Who just were on their porches. So we have to examine both the procedural, systemic, institutional issues, grapple with those and so that we can protect people, and at the same time, just constantly be working on our own thinking around these issues. David, were you
The other thing we need to take a look at is what we do in the church. Most of our churches are focused on what goes on inside those walls. We live, my wife and I live in a community where now the Nepalese people are moving in, and they are not accepted. They're dark-skinned. Okay. They don't worship God as we do. They worship completely differently. And I think our job is to set up relationships, friendships. And somehow that's not happening within our churches. Everything is focused on, if you'll come to the church, we'll have a program for you. And we have to start getting out into our neighborhoods and setting up personal relationships. That's how the early church grew.
Mm-hmm. That's excellent. And reaching out specifically to those who are different from us.
Absolutely.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I agree with what's said. And I think about Jesus and how he went to the woman at the well.
Mm-hmm.
And so many instances in the Bible where Jesus counteracted the norm, the traditions, the culture. And we as Christians, as followers of Christ, we have to do that. What are we willing to sacrifice is the question. Are we willing to sacrifice the friendships, the networking, our buddies who kind of make jokes about certain things or put up with things? Are we willing to contact our Congress people at the local level, at the federal level, at the state level, and take a stand? It's going to be a sacrifice. We're going to go against the grain, but these are human lives at stake, black and white, because, the enemy is using all kinds of people to oppress other people because he's defeated.
Amen, Alexia. I'm giving you the snaps on that one. Shasta, your facial expressions are giving me life this afternoon. It's 1:30. That's our time. I did just post also in the chat area a book that I highly recommend. It's called Rethinking Incarceration by Dominique Gilliard, who is also a man of faith. And what I like about his text is that it takes just mercy, I think, to another level in terms of helping the Christian community to think about solutions. And so I would recommend that. There are 3 books that I think everybody needs to read as it relates to issues of criminal justice reform, incarceration, and race. And those are The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, which is now a classic. The New Jim Crow, Just Mercy, of course, and this book, Rethinking Incarceration by Dominique Gilliard, which I think offers a lot in terms of a way forward for the faith community. Okay, that's all I have. Thank you for allowing me to moderate our discussion, and I will turn things back over to Tim.
So thank you everyone for attending, and a special thank you to you, Dr. Johnson, for facilitating this conversation. Hopefully this is the start of a conversation that we will now take out to our several different communities and our spheres of influence. And just so you know, on the screen right now is a QR code. If you have your cell phone, we got fancy this year. So you can scan that. It'll take you to our YouTube channel. So you can subscribe there and you'll get a notification when this video of this session and all of our homecoming events are uploaded. So you can relive them and share them with folks that you would love to have see them after the fact.
Tim,